Now please join me in welcoming home a most accomplished and distinguished alumnus, Steve Jurvetson, class of '85.
Well, thank you, Mr. Holtberg. And thank you, J.T. Sutcliffe, and the teachers that have made my life path possible. It wasn't so very long ago that I was sitting up here, much like you. It's just such a great honor to be here today at the podium. I never would have imagined it. When I was sitting there, I was a bit socially awkward, a bit insecure. In short, I was a young budding geek. It took me a few more years to fully embrace that identity. But it's something that I now celebrate, and I want to try to share a little bit with you today. As I thought about preparing remarks for tonight, the first thought that came to my mind was my commencement speaker and all the great things I learned from him. And I couldn't remember a single thing he said. And so with the fear that the same thing may happen tonight as you just want to get on with it and get your diplomas, I want to leave you at least with something. I've taken up photography as a hobby, and this is a spectacular view. So everyone smile. Oh, that's good. You blinked. One more time. Smile. I'll put that on Flickr for you later tonight, so you can have it. You'll at least have a photo to share with friends. And I'm going to address my comments to the students, even though I face your families. So what perspective can I share with you today? As you heard, I work in venture capital. So I have the great honor, in a sense, to work with people that are setting out to change the world. It's a remarkable career choice for people with a short attention span because you're always learning something new. We basically invest in startup companies founded by bold entrepreneurs with a hallucinogenic optimism and desire to change the world, much like many of you. I get to live vicariously through their successes, their trials and tribulations, and it allows me to surf the frontiers of the unknown of science and technology as these bold scientists and business people forge the future time and time again. I get to hear the pitches of the Skypes, the Hotmails, the companies that you heard in the introduction, when they're just a gleam in the entrepreneur's eye, without a product or even a prototype in most cases. So I'll try to share with you some of their stories, as well as my own. At St. Mark's, I was a computer programmer on the side, and then became a chip designer, as you heard, then a management consultant, then a marketing manager at Apple, and then I discovered venture capital, where I proceeded to diversify, investing first in internet companies, then nanotech companies, then synthetic biology companies, energy and cleantech companies. It's as if my career path has ADD. But if I had stopped at any of these earlier branches in life, I may never have found my true calling. When fortune taps you figuratively on the shoulder and offers you a chance to do something special, to find your calling in life is priceless. But there's also a time when you look back on your life as an adult and realize that of all the myriad possibilities that you envisioned as a child, your life has tracked the path of progressive narrowing. Now that was actually an observation by Henry Kissinger in the opening of his undergraduate thesis. He was just a few years older than you, yet he was already that depressingly mature. Remember as a child when you dreamed of being an astronaut, or a fireman, or maybe a race car driver? I hope Kissinger's warning will not be your fate. In many ways, college should further open your world and field of view. The tree branches again, and the childlike rush of myriad horizons opens anew. So try to embrace something new. Try to explore the world. There'll be plenty of time to iterate and execute as you age. But unfortunately, most workplaces plunge us into deep mental ruts. They reward competencies and are self-reinforcing rather than diversifying. And they encourage people to obtain and acquire domain expertise instead of continuing to ask stupid questions and learn new things. We need to find ways out of these ruts, rediscover and rekindle the creativity that many of us left behind in childhood. Whether by hobbies or a career that rewards diversity, you have to make a determined effort to keep that part of yourself alive. But the payoff is a keener, more nimble intellect. In short, celebrate the childlike mind. Geeks do this naturally. From what I can see, the best scientists and engineers nurture a childlike mind. From Newton to Richard Feynman and some of the famous ones of the past, even Einstein himself, they're playful, open-minded, and unrestrained by the inner voice of reason, collective cynicism, or fear of failure. So why do we say childlike mind? Alison Gopnik wrote a fascinating book called Scientists in the Crib, which I recommend any new geek about to have a child, in which she writes, babies are just plain smarter than we are. At least if that means being able to learn something new. They think, draw conclusions, make predictions, look for explanations, and even do experiments. In fact, scientists are successful precisely because they emulate what children do naturally. That was inspiring to me. Of course, they lack wisdom and experience, but they are amazing learning machines, largely due to the massive synaptic connections that they have at that age. It's perhaps a bit daunting, but at the age of 2 and 3, you peaked with 10 times the synapses you have today and twice the energy burn of the adult brain. It's all downhill from here. The human experience of cognitive development is that our capability peaks in the teen years, holds steady until late 30s, and then begins a gradual straight line decline until we die. That's me. I'm well into that curve. It's the rare individual by chance or good fortune that can orchestrate a life around pursuits that provide regular mental exercise capable of combating that slope. At one time it was thought we were born with a fixed number of neurons that die off gradually over the course of our lives, perhaps with a drink or two, never to be replenished. That's how understood to be emphatically wrong. Although we can't regrow an entire brain or injure or fix major injuries, we can in fact form new synaptic connections, and we do so all the time. This phenomenon is called neuroplasticity. And through cognitive exercise, you can actually dial up the rate of rewiring. Physical exercise is repetitive, cognitive exercise is eclectic. And as we extend human lifespans with better healthcare, with each passing decade, we expose the weak evolutionary link. Our brains were not built to last that long. And in the not too distant future, I think we will look back at the present day and marvel that we didn't do mental exercise to stay cognitively fit, much like we would marvel if someone never did physical exercise that they would somehow expect to stay physically fit. Now I realize, for someone your age, about to experience collegiate life for the first time, it may be dangerous and downright reckless to suggest you fully embrace immaturity. I'm referring only to cognitive curiosity. As for your physical health, risk, and well-being, I can only give you this piece of advice. If you ever find yourself surrounded by a crowd of people chanting, "Do it, do it," it is almost always a good idea not to do it. Believe me, there will come a time when that will ring true. Lifelong learning is especially critical in a rapidly changing world. And adult re-education is just one sign of that. It is a booming market. So consider a few things. Consider public speaking if you haven't done so already. It is a learned skill, not an innate ability. I credit my years of St. Mark's debate for my ability to stand here before you today without completely freaking out. And it's been my observation that the people who rise to the top of any organization, be it a business, a nonprofit, or in politics, are inherently good speakers. Consider computer science. A bit self-serving, of course, but I recently learned that most of the computer science graduates and people entering the computer science program at Stanford had no prior exposure whatsoever to the field and never done a computer program. When they were trying to decide between econ and poli-sci, they said, well, I'll give computer science a try. So it's not too late to become a fine geek. But most importantly, please explore a bit around in college for those of you who think you know exactly what you want to do in life. And one of the reasons for that is that the world is increasingly interdisciplinary. The critical advances that will change the world are more likely to come from the interstices between academic disciplines than from the warm core of a purist pursuit of, let's say, just physics or just chemistry. The most rapidly growing engineering major today is bioengineering, exploring the intersection of formally discrete domains. Now, when you think about innovation, we may all agree that it's important. It's determining increasingly the fate of nations, of companies, of entire industries, and it changes the context of our lives in profound ways. It's also, in my opinion, a great source of optimism. And although all innovation is important, it seems so random. So people who try to study innovative processes inevitably come up with very hollow and vacuous recommendations of how to innovate. So let me talk about this for just a moment, and pose a question to everyone in the audience, student and parent alike, teacher alike. What is the most important company 20 years from now? And try to pick one. If you're not particularly into companies, who is the most important person 20 years from now? I'm willing to bet even money that not a single person assembled here tonight is correct. And that's because I'm particularly smart or I have the answer. It's because that company in person does not exist yet. The company does not exist today. The person does not yet have a name. Looking back, in retrospect, it makes it coherent and comprehensible what I just said, that the future always belongs to the new, the entrepreneur, the new entrant. 20 years in the past, Google did not exist. So entrepreneurs change the world and always have. You are the leaders of the next wave of important companies, the ones that will disrupt business as usual. So take for a moment under consideration those companies, those new companies that have created billions of dollars of wealth. Microsoft, Dell, Apple, Google, Facebook. What do they all have in common? They were started by students, most of them teenagers. You're not too young to dream big. So what great new idea is going to change the world and actually make a difference? Imagine that we voted all today on a series of startups. We paraded all 50,000 business plans that we get each year in our office before you, and we all wanted to vote on the winner. Who's the best idea that's going to change the world? So that, I would bet against that popular vote. Instead, I would look to the ideas that most of you ridicule, yet a handful of you defend passionately. Because in retrospect, the companies that change the world are always considered bad ideas at their founding. eBay, Hotmail, Google, Skype, laughed at by investors, venture capitalists alike. So when you first think about doing something entrepreneurial, in a big company, in a nonprofit, or starting a company, let me give you this advice. If everyone thinks your idea is a good one, it's not disruptive enough to change the world. It's too obvious. If most people laugh at what you're saying, or say it will never work, but a handful think it's brilliant, you may be onto something. And of course, if nobody agrees with you, you're probably wrong. Do consider that possibility. When it comes to finding innovation in an organization or in others, leaders can tune the process of innovation more than they can hope to dictate the product of innovation. It's much like evolution itself. You can tune the parameters, not the outcomes. And one of the reasons that is increasingly important in our world is that unpredictable events increasingly define our world. Sometimes they're called black swan events, things that make sense in retrospect, but no one was talking about them before they happened. These could be in business world companies like Google and eBay before they were Google and eBay. Part of the backstory here is that technological change has been growing exponentially throughout history. Some of you are familiar with Moore's Law, the co-founder of Intel. They noticed that microprocessors were doubling in power every year, but costing about the same. This is why your computers always seem to get better, and you take it for granted after a few years. Moore's Law has been pretty important to the computer and communications industries, and over time, as each lab science becomes a simulation science, it changes and goes on to a pace of innovation similar to Moore's Law. Cleantech and biotech are doing that today. It innervates industries over time as it becomes more and more powerful. And these cozy businesses that haven't seen much innovation for decades, like fuels and chemicals, are going to start to. This nonlinear pace of change is a perpetual source of disruption, creating wave after wave of opportunities for new entrants. For an example I'm sure you can all relate to, think of the Apple iPod. Back when I was your age, I cherished my Sony Walkman, and the older people in the audience will know what I'm talking about. You may not have heard of the Sony Walkman. It was a tape player, did pretty much what an iPod does, but linearly and very poorly. Everyone had one. It was the only brand in portable music, and yet Sony totally missed the boat, right? This nonlinear disruption of memory prices and disk drive prices going through thresholds, making the MP3 player possible, just didn't enter the radar screen, and it was a new entrant to the business, Apple not really in the music business in any way, that created the iPod phenomenon. Coming back to Moore's Law, when most people think about it, they think about it as something unique to the integrated circuit, a very geeky subject that only Intel and companies like Intel should care about. But it's actually a refraction of a much longer-term trend spanning over a century. If you recast Moore's Law as something that people actually care about, like computational power or storage, data storage, if you cast it that way, you can look at a longer-term trend that spans multiple generations of different technologies, from mechanical calculators through vacuum tubes to discrete transistors. And Moore's Law continues unwaveringly for over 110 years, a double exponential. And it is completely exogenous to the economy. The Great Depression, World War I and II, all recessions have had no impact on the long-term trajectory of computing capability that the human species is able to create. Scientists do not rest during recessions. Do not stop innovating during recessions. We instead use the tools from one generation to build the next, and this is true for all of technology. In fact, it's true for all innovation. Brian Arthur of the Santa Fe Institute argues that every invention is a novel combination of prior inventions. So over time, the combinatorial possibility space for new inventions grows exponentially. It's not just exogenous to economic swings. These inventions create the economy, the economic growth that we cherish. When you look at all of these areas of accelerating change in technology and roll them up, there's a simple summary to remember. Today, 20 years of technological progress will be equivalent to the entire 20th century. In other words, the next 20 years are equivalent to the past 100. For most of us who don't remember what life was like in 1900, that might be a bit abstract. So let me just remind you that in 1900 in the United States, there were only 144 miles of paved road. Over 90% of Americans were born at home without a telephone, never graduated from high school, didn't have a bathtub at home, didn't have reliable access to electricity. Consider how much technology-driven change has compounded in the last century, and consider that an equivalent amount of progress will occur in one human generation from 2000 to 2020, by the time your career is likely hitting its zenith. Exponential progress perpetually pierces the linear presumptions of our intuition and shrinks our forecast horizons. Future shock is no longer an intergenerational timescale. For a current example, think of genetics, and I'll share just a brief story of an amazing entrepreneur. I've had the honor to help start a company called Synthetic Genomics, run by Craig Venner. He's been on a 15-year quest to create a synthetic life form. Yesterday, you may have noticed he succeeded. Venner was the first person to sequence the human genome, rather his team was, and he relied on the predictive power of Moore's Law to do it. He realized that compute power would catch up at just the right moment to be able to assemble the human genome from random overlapping fragments. So you could just randomly break it into segments using a perfume bottle, sequence those segments, and let the computer figure it all out. It was beyond computational power when he started, but he knew Moore's Law would catch up. He saw in advance this method would beat the government to sequence the genome, and in fact that 90% of the work would get done in the last 6 months, which is a bit of an unusual thing for a 10-year project. He didn't sit on his laurels. that one accomplishment wasn't enough. He then ran around in an ocean vessel and sequenced ocean seawater, entire ecosystems at a time, again with the same prediction that computational power would catch up and that we could stitch together after the fact all of the myriad creatures that exist in the sea, millions and tens of millions of bacteria and viruses in every milliliter of seawater. And in so doing, he made a breakthrough no one else has made. He has doubled the number of genes, actually, it's much more than that. He's grown by a factor of 10x the number of genes known to science in the last year with one project alone, and has grown by 100-fold the number of genes known to be associated with energy harvesting from the sun, things like chlorophyll or rhodopsins. Pretty amazing accomplishment. He didn't stop there. In creating synthetic life, as he announced yesterday, this is the first time a free-living, reproducing species has a computer as its parent. Literally what he has done is emailed files of A, T's, G's, and C's to a variety of synthesis labs around the world that FedEx back these short strings of DNA, 10 to 30 letters long, used yeast to stitch them together, and had complete authorship fidelity. He can now write the code of life as if it were a poem or a computer program. He takes an existing cell, removes 100% of its DNA, puts the artificial DNA in, changes the species from one to another, a form of genetic alchemy. This new organism is viable, reproducing creatures, create trillions of children, and it is a completely new species, watermarked with all kinds of interesting textbook quotes and, as any computer program could with comments. Why this is so symbolically important is that I think it'll usher in a new era of biotech, where we don't physically cut and paste from existing living organisms, but we treat it as code. And we can create with a new fidelity and rapidity as never seen before. A different researcher at Harvard has created 4 billion genetically distinct microbes per day. Now, why would you do all this? Well, these microbes naturally digest waste things like CO2, municipal waste, and produce fuels, chemicals, plastics, things we care about. Hence my earlier comment about disruption to come in the fuel and chemical industry. And it's not just researchers like Venner that are doing it. There's actually teenagers doing this all around the world. There's an international genetically engineered machines competition run by teenagers and 20-year-olds who re-engineer E. coli to make films that take pictures out of bacteria, that sense waste products, that can do all kinds of amazing things, re-engineering microbes as if they were Lego bricks. And I think this is a bold new world that we're entering and that our students are entering, where we, again, can re-engineer the information systems of biology in very powerful ways that weren't considered possible just a few years ago. And it's just one of many things going on in the sciences, which is one I wanted to share with you today. So that one example, I hope you can see that entrepreneurs change the world, and in this case, sometimes many times over. For another example, consider Elon Musk, who founded PayPal, then SpaceX, which is building the successor to the space shuttle, then Tesla Motors, the pioneer in electric cars, a company, by the way, that's registered to go public, which would be the first US car company since Henry Ford. These people, and entrepreneurs like them, are our true national heroes. It's not our sports stars or our entertainers. And in countries like China, that's obvious to all. What drives them is actually a universal human quest. We all strive for symbolic immortality, to leave something important behind after our short time on this earth. Entrepreneurs create companies that outlast themselves, sometimes, like in Hewlett-Packard's case, named after themselves. Some create everlasting works of art or philanthropic acts of kindness. For many, we also find expression, of course, in our children and the generations left behind, and believe me, your teachers are thinking of you as well in that context. In the way they all play, as you said, a surrogate role in that development. And it goes without saying, of course, that some find it in a belief in the afterlife. It's a powerful human driving factor. So it is my hope for you that you find a reservoir of self-confidence so that you can be humble, that you learn enough to never stop learning. And rest assured that we are entering an intellectual renaissance, interwoven across the sciences. There is no better time to be a student of technology, no better time to start a company, no better time to learn something new. Individuals with good ideas are empowered as never before. And schools, well, schools are stepping stones on a path of lifelong learning. So skip forward on your future path with a playful curiosity. Consider your destiny on this planet as something grand. Change the world for the better. And you will find that success and the sublime satisfaction of symbolic immortality. Thank you, and congratulations to the class of 2010.
Steve, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, your perspective, your wit with us, and for prompting us to think more broadly and more aggressively about the future than we might otherwise have.